Okay, so we've talked about the different parts of the tree and how they contribute to fruitfulness. And the belief tree gives us important ways to think about our actions and our values so that we end up becoming quite fruitful. So our question is, how did we end up with all of the bad fruit today? And how do we develop good fruit? What were God's intentions? So let's do a quick review. You remember, if I start bending here, we lose the camera. So I won't do the actions, but you could. So you want to remember the soil is what? The soil is the worldview. Okay, so we're going to remind ourselves here on our tree. And what's next? The next is the roots. These are the things that we believe, right? So we'll put that there. Now what comes up next? This is the trunk. Trunk is what we value, isn't it? Then what comes next in a tree is the branches, all right? And the branches are the principles, isn't it? And finally, the point of the tree is to grow fruit. The fruit is the final of our choices and our actions. Okay, so this is how our belief tree grows. And we're either going to produce good fruit or bad fruit. Now, if we're living to be successful, we see a lot of bad fruit with that. If we're living to be fruitful, we see all kinds of lovely fruit. We see this tree, don't we? How did this start? Well, the beginning of formal education outside the home was back in the empire of the ancient Greeks. And that's the world that Jesus would have grown up in, around the Mediterranean Sea. And the Greek Empire spread through Asia and up into Europe. And they were the most powerful empire on the earth at that time. And they had they were very gifted people. And so many of our ideas about truth and beauty come from that day. And even though they were conquered later by the military power of Rome, they had such a strong culture that it says, Rome conquered Greece with the military, but Greece conquered Rome with the ideas of the mind. The Greek culture just adopted all of the Greek values and thinking as their own. And so to this day, many of us are still operating out of a Greek mindset, Greek thinking, and Greek values. One of the things that they pioneered was education outside of the family. Up until that time, children were raised to learn a trade within their family, either from their own father or from an uncle. The girls learned the trades from the mother, and the aunts, the grandparents, this kind of thing. The Greeks decided to bring in specialized teachers called tutors. And they would gather a group of boys outside of the home in a classroom, and they would teach these boys. Now, what was the purpose of this school? The purpose of this school was to train the next generation of leaders to lead society. Now, the only people who could go to these schools were boys, and boys whose parents were Greek. They had to be landowners. Okay, so they had to be wealthy. This is what qualified you to be a leader, to be able to go to school. So it had to do with ethnicity, it had to do with who your father knew, how wealthy you were. Okay, does that sound familiar? Isn't that how we get into education and continue to rise higher and higher in education? And the purpose was to give these boys, these future leaders, special knowledge They had knowledge that no one else would have, and that's what qualified them to lead. Now, knowledge is important. It's like fuel for the fire. We have to have information. But they weren't expected to apply it. They weren't expected to work with their hands. They weren't expected to do anything. It was merely having the information, having exercised the brain to learn something. Okay? So the things that they learned, they weren't expected to apply them. They had conquered much of the known world, and so they had slaves that did hard work, manual work, that did all the farming and the building and things like that. Then they had a layer of educated slaves who were the managers and the teachers and who did a lot of the work of running their society. And so the citizens didn't have much to do. Okay? And that was the ideal. We are the right ethnicity and we're wealthy, therefore we don't have to work. We are qualified to rule others. And so the things that they would have studied, they studied mathematics, but it was for the abstract thinking of understanding the theory. They weren't expected to keep track of the income of the city and how it was spent, for example. So their knowledge was for a few elite people to have special knowledge that lifted them up above all others. Now, does that sound like education today? It actually does, doesn't it? Education today looks like this. Okay? In some countries, the biggest layer are the people that don't get to go to school at all. Most countries, lots and lots of children are able to go to primary school. Okay, so that's the big layer at the bottom. Well, then what happens? If you want to get into the next level of schooling, secondary school it's called in some countries, oftentimes you have to compete. You have to get a certain exam mark. Perhaps you have to start to pay. Perhaps you have to belong to the right tribe so that your dad can get you a spot. Okay? And so fewer people can go to secondary school. Well, then the next step is university. That's very difficult to get into in most countries. It's more and more people are excluded. There are fewer and fewer special people that are allowed access to this knowledge that no one else has. Once you're in university, then of course you want to get your master's, and those very few at the top that have a PhD. Well, they have very specialized knowledge, and that knowledge could be put to wonderful use. But so often, instead, it's not put to good use. It only serves to lift that person up above everyone else. And they're admired. Oh, they have more education. They know more things. Well, knowing things doesn't mean that you're a better person. If you have a bad person, a thief, and you send him to college and he gets a PhD, now you have an educated thief. Now he can steal more money because he has more knowledge. So education alone doesn't qualify. And we see that the foundations of modern education were based in a pagan culture with a pagan root system. It was based to exclude so that only a very few had special knowledge at the top. So if the purpose of life is to get to the top, the purpose of education is to get to the top. You see? Now, let's look at how do we become fruitful? What is the role of education in being fruitful? Well, at about the same time in the ancient world, as the Greeks were coming to power, God's people were also living in their country, the Hebrew people. And God gave them very clear instructions about all areas of life. He talked to them about health care and how to be healthy. He talked to them about agriculture and taking care of their fields. He talked to them about how to raise their children, how to have a just legal system, how to be productive and fair in their business dealings, to generate wealth and to be generous. And so God gave them instructions in every area of life. And the purpose of Jewish education was to learn God's law in order to apply it. And in fact, the word to learn in Hebrew means to put into practice. There's no idea of knowing things just for the sake of knowing them. You have to know things in order to do something, in order to put God's laws into practice. Because then your society is just and peaceful and prosperous. Your families are thriving, the land is blessed. You can see all the promises of God in the Old Testament saying, if you'll live under my authority, if you'll apply my laws in every area of life, this is what my intentions are for you. And so the purpose of education in the Greek model was to learn God's law in order to apply it. So they would have learned things like mathematics so that they could have justice in their economic system, so they could keep accurate records, make sure they paid the full wages on time, make sure that they gave their tax, their tithes to the temple properly, keeping records. And we see records being kept in the Old Testament. So we know they understood math and they valued it as a tool of integrity and justice and generosity. So it's a very different picture of the purpose of education. And so we see that the Greeks were living this way and the Hebrews were living this way. So God's people don't always obey him fully, do they? I know I don't, and I'm sure that you don't. And so God's instructions are always perfect. How well we apply them is what determines the level of blessing that can be released through our lives. So we don't see in the Old or the New Testament the perfect application of all of God's laws and all of God's values. But in many areas, the Hebrew society was very different than other cultures around it because they were applying God's principles. So these are the roots of these educational systems. The difference between a Greek system, okay, do this with me, Greek system that is built to prepare children for a life of striving to be successful, or a Hebrew system that is built on obedience and faithfulness and service to others and to God. And so that expectation in education, you are learning in order to do. You are doing in order to be fruitful, to be a blessing, to honor God. So these are the roots of these educational systems. And when we understand these things, we are faced with the reality that we as Christian educators have got to really rethink how we have been doing education. We've all grown up in a Greek system, haven't we? We've all grown up in a world that gives us this message about being successful. And for most of us, we don't know any different. Many Christian schools don't look much different than public schools. The same systems, the same goals, the same atmosphere of striving and competition, shame if you fail and you don't have the best grades. Going after knowledge, trying to get the right answer on the test so you get the best answer. And of course, children need to learn. Of course they need knowledge and information. But why? That is the difference. And that changes even what we teach. It changes how we teach. We're trying to teach children in a context of love and relationship and putting things into practice. So what else could we be teaching? How should we be teaching? If our children aren't coming out of school with these qualities and these abilities, what do we need to do differently? What do we teach and how do we teach so that our children don't just have knowledge? Our children are fruitful. Our children have the skills and the character to put their knowledge to use and to be fruitful. And let us see again the glory of God come as it did in Solomon's day, when the nations honored Solomon's God. And they said, wow, your wisdom is so lovely, and there's such blessing on your people. They rest so nicely under your authority. I never imagined that it could be this good. Well, that's our place, isn't it? To raise men and women that take God's presence and God's truth into life, into the world, so that people are blessed and they are honoring God.